With Gears of War E-Day on the horizon, I was skulking around my channel the other day, and do you realize how long it's been since I've covered anything Gears of War related? Looks about 3 years, and with that, let's get into it. E-Day was a changing point for every single Saren on the planet Sera. Creatures from the ground would emerge that were stronger, faster, and more bloodthirsty than humanity had ever seen. Sarens were no strangers to war, as the UIR and the COG had just wrapped up the Pendulum Wars for the rights to the planet's emulsion. But therein lied the problem. This material was highly volatile and mutagenic, resulting in rust lung to spring forth from humans, creating a massive problem for the whole not dying an early death thing. I'll actually need to go back and make sure I didn't cover that in my emulsion video, and actually how much information I can dig up on that, and maybe, I don't know, make a more detailed video over the pathophysiology of rust lung itself if I haven't covered it in depth, and if you guys would like that. But until then, know that the Locust sprung up from humanity. As the war concluded with the firing of Malazar from the sky, the UIR finally relented and the Sarens would enter a period of peace for about 6 weeks, just long enough to take half a breath collectively as a society before the stories of old would present themselves once more. It was well known that for some reason or another, the entire planet appeared to have a kidnapping problem. People would just seem to go missing. People would claim that they saw the glinting of eyes in a storm drain line, or that they saw figures in the dark that looked larger than a human, but was still quite bipedal. Platforms that had workers who were drilling for emulsion would sometimes just have whoever was stationed there not turn back up for their shift. However, the numbers were never really high enough for there to be a national outcry for answers, just small grassroots campaigns designed to warn others of something being out there. They just didn't know what it actually was. Had they known what was below their feet, humanity would have been much more concerned about this growing threat, as more and more people would continually go missing. Eventually, all at once, Sera was besieged by another war. And this one was not about resources or just domination over an area, but outright derailing the assured extinction that was coming down the line. As described, reptilian creatures erupted from the ground from emergence holes. They would instantly begin firing on all civilian and military populations. Completely caught off guard, the COG would attempt to rally in order to create battle lines to give themselves at least half a chance at effectively coordinating counterattacks. But as the days drug on, every line would be broken, and most, if not all, defenses would be overrun. Evacuation points would be utterly destroyed, and large sections of the population would be cut off from others as they would meet their grisly fates without really any way to defend themselves. The most alarming aspect was the speed at which these creatures would move and the sheer power that they seemed to possess. Having no remorse, and with no way to reason with these things, every man, woman, and youngling was up on the chopping block, as these creatures were not going for domination over, just humanity. They were going for outright annihilation of the Homo sapiens race. Eventually, this would force the COG government, seeing that they really couldn't stop these things despite soldiers now fully aware of what these things are and how to fight them, which, if you're interested in that, basically just replace as many cells in their body with lead as possible. They would become absolutely desperate in order to halt their advance. The Hammer of Dawn would be deployed in many cities that had been besieged and were basically already taken over by the Locust Horde. This exceedingly controversial move would then bring about a distrust that many felt, who would then eventually become the Stranded. Some humans were still trying to escape the cities around this time, and instead of being met with friendly lines pushing back the locusts, they were met with an energetic blast from the sky that engulfed the cities in flames and left them as an ash statue that would stand as a testament of time to man's desperation during the opening days of the Locust War. The lessons learned from this opening act of the war was that A, these things are faster than humans. 2, they are organized and not just chaotic beasts running through an area. And D, there are several different versions of these creatures attacking, which are all going to require different ways to put them down. And this brings us to today's topic actually quite nicely. One creature exemplified itself in the worst ways possible. It would stand about 6 inches or so above the rest and regularly gets around 600 grams of protein a day, evidently. The Grenadier or Grenadier locust is not something that you should really be taking lightly. During the initial stages of E-Day, it was whispered about at first, but it would ultimately go on to be seen by many. These creatures that stood roughly about 6 inches taller, double the muscle mass, brandishing a Gnasher and a bolt-hock pistol, running headlong at the COG soldiers, blasting them apart, all while being fired on and not dropping like the other, more smaller variants would. Round after round put into their unarmored form, and yet still, unless you just outright remove the legs of the creature, it would still likely reach you in time before you could do enough damage. And that's just with one. With several running at a line, they would quickly overwhelm the defenses, leading to the continual pushback of the cog and what they were dealing with. And it would not just be the cog that was actually experiencing this. The UIR, or at least the remnants of it at this point, even with the war technically at its conclusion already, still, in some instances, they were dealing with cog stranded that may not have gotten the message yet that the war was over. And then along with that, when the Locust emerged, they were also fighting them, so they had to deal with a two-front war. This would ultimately go on to have the cog attempting to unite humanity to deal with this threat with their open arms program, taking in many UIR to join the cog to deal with this issue. But that is a video for another day, as today we are talking about the Grenadier. But first, this episode is sponsored by Raycon. Are you ready to have amazing quality for half the price of other brands? If you are, then go to buyraycon.com/Roanoke to get 20% off the fan favorite Everyday Earbuds Classic. Obviously, this is sponsored by Raycon. Are you ready for the classics? The return of the Everyday Earbud is the one that really you all know and love. It's the perfect way to tune out noise in the gym as one guy is screaming while just bench pressing the bar. With the drop of the latest version, the classic E25 model, now active noise cancellation, which we all know it was sorely missing, is in this model. Not to mention, with an 8-hour playtime and 32-hour battery life, your Raycons might just never leave your ears. I'm listening to Doom the Dark Ages soundtrack right now, actually as I write this. I know. It's growing on me like a fungus for some reason. Who knows why? So if you're on the fence, I would also direct you to the thousands of 5-star reviews. I know I love my Raycons, and I'm fairly certain you would love yours too. So if you're ready to start enjoying premium audio at half the price, then go to buyraycon.com/Roanoke to get 20% off the fan favorite Everyday Earbuds Classic. So I think the best way to do this is to first discuss their physical morphology in comparison to like the standard drone, as that, I mean the drone is more comparable, but then again, the drone is also comparable to a cog soldier. Which actually, I had a conspiracy theory anyhow, that there was quite literally gene manipulation going on with every cog soldier, because when they appeared to join, they were relatively normal in size to a standard human, but as the war dragged on, everyone got absolutely ridiculously swole. Could have been all that chainsaw dueling, I suppose, but anyhow, then we can move on to the internal structures of the brain that would have to have been altered given their propensity towards increased aggression levels, as well as an ability that you may not know that they actually had. And we'll probably also touch on the endocrine system, because that would have to be overhauled. So when we look at a Grenadier, it's clear many things must be happening internally concerning this creature that, even amongst their own kind, puts them in a different category. While not as large as, like, say, a boomer, they are still quite larger than a drone. When placed next to a drone, which is a difficult task because they do not usually like to stop running around the whole time, you'll see that first and foremost, they lack the amount of armoring that drones typically will have on the top portion of their body, depending on the variant of Grenadier, which is related directly to their rank. The drone will have the top portion layered with thick pieces of tiered armor, protecting its body as it is less durable. The Grenadier, however, more so concerning the lower ranking Grenadier, will typically only sport armoring on its legs and pelvic region. As you move up in rank, concerning these Grenadiers, you will begin to see shoulder pauldrons appear and maybe like a strap armoring covering like specifically the heart and aortic region. We can assume that much like getting shot in the heart as a human, this area is probably going to be relatively a weak point, so you need to protect it. So let's begin now where we all know that we need to. There are images online where you can more easily see this. However, nobody really wants to sit here and just look at a still image. This isn't 2018 Roanoke slideshow. The wild time. Go back and watch the original Grenadier video. Yo! Anyways, the Grenadier will have 3 toes on its feet, which continues to actually be inspired by the highly mutagenic effects of the emulsion and the genetic tampering conducted by Niles. That guy was completely cracked out for creating these things. The feet, however, are in standard plantigrade structuring that we would actually come to expect in other versions of the Locust. As we move up the legs, the calves are absolutely massive, powerful Achilles tendons flanked by a large soleus muscle that connects up to the gastrocnemius, which allows for it to support the weight of this creature. It is highly likely that given the strength exhibited, that the connective tissue has been doubled or tripled in its body, giving the Grenadier likely a weight of around 300 to 350 pounds, which is 136 to 158.7 kilograms in non-freedom units. Imagine using metric. Excuse me. It may seem like just a pretty small detail, but the reality is the Achilles tendon actually tears quite frequently in humanity, like even with those in a healthy weight range. Therefore, these things, to even be able to leap and run as they do, these tendons would need to be massive and their density would need to be much higher than what humanity has. The same idea can be applied actually to the kneecap area as well. The patellar ligaments, meniscus, quadricep tendon, ACL, all would have to be beefed up in order to contend with this weight and movement, and you can assume on every joint that all of the connective tissue has been beefed up. Because the muscle that is used to move it has weight to itself, the reality is the Grenadier is likely topping out this form in terms of weight and strength while still being quite maneuverable. We see kind of when it goes too far with the boomer, as this shows that the locusts, if they get much larger than they already are, their bodies will have difficulty dealing with this amount of weight as a bipedal organism. Therefore, it makes them way less capable of movement, and the boomer doesn't have any agility. So as we move up to the thigh region, Grenadiers continue to look like Olympic weightlifters. We can assume that the femurs in this area contend with massive forces of the quadriceps pulling on the legs, and the anchor points on the pelvis would be likely bolstered more so than that of a human, or in fact even a drone. Moving past the lower pelvic region, it also should be known that drones are not Ken dolls down there. They appear to have what is needed to reproduce, but have you ever tried hooking up with a berserker? Wouldn't recommend it.
What do you mean by that?
So as we move to the abdominal region, we see the locust drones just in general have hypertrophy of the abdominal muscles as well as defined pectoral muscles. But the Grenadier, take all that, pretty much double it. Of course, just north of that in the shoulder and trapezius region is where these things look ridiculously bulky. The trapezius muscle connects to the neck region in humans naturally, and the Grenadiers are no different. But with the level of muscle presentation, this in some cases almost eliminates the profile of the neck, making this area extremely powerful and also providing a fair bit of protection. As we move to the deltoid region, the Grenadier will continue to be swole as large deltoids are also covered with a thick gray skin, acting as a natural armoring for them. Moving down to the bicep and tricep region of this creature, it continues to show similar hypertrophy, and at the forearm level, you can see that they are roughly about as thick as the biceps and triceps, and this is important as this indicates that the gripping strength of the hands can probably just completely crush a human skull quite easily.
God damn.
You do not want to get in hand-in-hand like combat with this thing. So the hands are in their standard form, unlike the feet, having actually a thumb and 4 fingers tipped with massive claws. What's interesting is we see this with geckos, where they have different number of, I guess you'd call them fingers, instead of like toes, like it just is. So this is actually where they kind of delineate themselves pretty acutely from humanity, because we have 5 fingers and toes, well, we have 4 fingers and 1 thumb, and we have 4 toes and 1 toe thumb, I guess is the best way to put it. But the head of this creature looks similar to that of a drone, but has a much flatter face than you might imagine when compared to a drone. However, this larger nose is actually important and does serve a purpose. The Grenadier continues to be a bucket of ugly, having sharp teeth and raised brow ridges indicating the endocrine system is dealing with different levels of hormones, which we are about to get there here in a moment. On the top of the head, the same patchy gray covering can be seen and also runs down the back of the neck. That is also present on the shoulders and basically all the armors, and it's just indicating a higher than standard skin growth leading to callousing, which clearly would make you more resilient. Like if you're moving around in a cave, for instance, abrasions from cave walls would be nice to avoid if you had thin skin, but they do not. Everything, like the top part of their body is just a giant callus. Internally, these creatures have several things happening to cause this increase in like muscle and assumedly bone mass and skin growth. It's important to remember that with the Grenadier, which is directly related to the drone, that they are born out of humanity. As rust lung was discovered, those who were infected were placed into camps in order to better understand the disease and attempt to actually fix the problem. That was kept real hush-hush because they were kind of placing ill people in camps and then experimenting on them. These experiments would ultimately continue on with very few people even remotely knowing about what was going on, because if you're in a position of power that you were just elected into and this has been a long-standing thing, it's probably better if you don't know about it, because then it could unravel the whole thing. So eventually the project focus would change as the mutagenic effects would be discovered. The first creature fully mutated, which would be a locust precursor, were the sires. The sires were violently mutated humans who were functionally just animals in terms of neural operations, but their cells would be combined with Mira's genes, which would ultimately go on to create the locust drone. That is the quick and dirty of it, but actually I do have a sires episode, I believe, but the drones themselves would be more human in appearance. Again, comparison to the sires because those just looked absolutely horrific. But ultimately, it shows that the internal kind of functioning of the locus are still very much so former human. And in this case, we can assume then that many of the systems that our bodies have, their bodies have, and likewise their own forms would respond in kind like ours would. So for this creature, the key factor we can assume here is that human growth hormone, or I guess at this point it'd be locust growth hormone, is likely at a much higher level, which would then have the cascading consequences for its actual form. There are several areas of the brain of the Grenadier that either have grown larger or comparatively atrophied to a degree. But first we can assume the master gland is working at a higher capacity. The pituitary gland would be saturating the body with growth hormone, leading to the increased muscle mass that can be seen all over. However, with humans, we see this kind of an arise at like puberty, and then more of a stabilization of it being released over time. But with this creature, it's clear it is going to be released in high amounts quite regularly and probably just stay high. And this would in turn lead to the osteoblast to continue increasing the bone density, allowing for the muscular growth to be viable, as otherwise it's entirely possible the bone could just be snapped by the actual power that the muscle has. And I'm just gonna throw it out there, the caloric requirement for these things would be astronomical. You're talking like powerlifting guys who eat, close to like 8,000, 10,000 calories a day or something like that. That's how much these guys would have to eat just to maintain this amount of mass that they have. Also, it's clear the aggression seen and warrior-like mentality of just rushing headlong into battle with little fear would likely mean that testosterone levels are off the chart of what could be considered normal in humans. And also, this is sort of just like kind of a quick and dirty of this, you can tell by the brow ridge being as thick as it is that they were developed under extreme testosterone levels. So anyway, this would all indicate that the testes of the Grenadier are also still producing at a much higher level, making them as savage and aggressive as they are. Basically, humanity compared to them are just a bunch of nerds pushing up our glasses the whole time. Testosterone also plays a significant role in the growth of muscle, and seeing as it's an anabolic hormone, this means that it helps with protein synthesis, which is precisely what this creature would need in order to effectively grow to the size that it actually is. The hormone cocktail swirling within its veins would make it an absolutely brutal creature to come across, but these hormones, apart from just being released by an enlarged pituitary gland or whatever it has going on between its legs, would indicate that likely other areas of the brain have been affected as well. So let's talk about atrophy first, because clearly these guys are not going to be sporting the standard Homo sapien home field advantage with neurological intricacies. Basically, the first word of the spelling bee, they're getting wrong. Areas of the brain, like the frontal lobe in particular, which is known to work with the amygdala to perform risk assessment, has most definitely been decreased in ability. The Grenadier does not appear to think about the most logical way to keep itself alive, and given that the hormones are flooding its system, this just further compounds that issue. Now, a bit of a caveat here is that just because a brain is smaller doesn't necessarily mean that there's like an intellect issue. In fact, Einstein had a smaller than average brain comparatively to other people. So big brain doesn't always mean smart brain, but these guys' brains are, well, you could call it a hormonal issue. You could also just call it being utilized in a different way. Anyhow, although given the natural build that they have and the ability to withstand direct shots to their bodies that would otherwise gravely injure a drone, perhaps they do not really have to worry as much, but enough lead will still fix the problem of putting them down. But because of this behavioral quirk, you could call it, of running directly into bullets, it's clear the frontal lobe, while it's going to be there in some capacity, it is likely much smaller than average in comparison to humans, and as a result, complex thinking and planning have completely gone out the window. This is not to say, however, that they cannot think on the fly in order to deal with something, but what you are dealing with is a more singular-minded creature who is blinded by their own aggression and has less emotional control over that aggression than comparatively what a drone would be dealing with. And actually, there is a reason the frontal lobe should be structurally smaller, as there is another area altered, but we'll get there momentarily. Other areas, likely atrophied to a degree, are several points on the cerebrum used to kind of dictate thought and planning, as the frontal lobe is not really the end-all be-all for all this. It's just where most of the thinking is done. Other areas of the cerebrum support many other abilities like hearing, sight, and sensory information. Hearing going to be in the temporal lobe, sight is going to be the occipital lobe, and sensory information in general, like touch and stuff, is going to be kind of in the parietal area. But movement in general, such as the cerebellum or the primary motor cortex located in the parietal lobe, is going to be important, so those are going to be maintained. So I would imagine while some areas of the cerebrum are smaller, they may have been, like, I'm going to make up a word here. They may have just been outright neuroplasticized in order to now move this gigantic body. Within the brain are also likely many other areas that were bolstered heavily given what we are seeing. We know about the pituitary gland being larger, which actually we see those in if you've never heard of what acromegaly is, it's essentially gigantism in humans. The same idea can be applied to the Grenadier, creating a larger creature, but the amygdala, which is known to detect threats and induce a fight or flight, has been altered. But Roanoke, how has it been altered? I'm glad you asked. I mean, look at these things. Let's see here. So basically, given that the Grenadiers have a one-track mind, the amygdala recognizes these threats, which are the cog, and then induces only one thing: fight. The body will be flooded with adrenaline further, helping the Grenadier ignore pain and overwhelming odds against it as it rushes in with absolute zero fear. The limbic system overall has likely been increased in size and communication in order to help the amygdala exercise more control over the brain and body. The cerebellum has also likely increased in size in the back of the head in order to help coordinate more muscular movements, but I do wonder at something. Humanity has more finely tuned muscular contractions when dealing with our environment. This is how we were able to do things like riding or working on a 69 Mustang where a bolt is located at a nigh unreachable location, and you can only turn it a quarter turn at a time, and it's taking forever to get the bolt out, and the fine muscle movement is now starting to seize your hand in an awkward position. Very annoying. But the other side of that is humanity has this more, lighter touch, which isn't necessarily as common in the animal kingdom. Take other primates, for example. Chimps, while physically smaller than us, and if you bring up that swole chimp, it's important to remember humans can also look like this too, but the point is chimps lack this same fine tuning, so everything they do is actually using more power than what we could deem necessary. And this has also moved up the strength scale, which is why chimps can basically rip your arm off. Our brains actively prevent us from using 100% of our strength in our entire lives because to do so means you risk massive injury to your body. My favorite example is a man who had a boulder fall on him while he was hiking, and as it fell, he put up his hands to stop it because that's what you're going to do, and it actually fell into a bench press position. As it fell, he grabbed onto it, but he was sliding towards a cliff's edge because of the combined weight. Being life or death, his brain removed the restrictions it normally has on strength output, which allowed for him to bench press what was thought to be about an 800-pound boulder off of his chest, preventing him from going over with said boulder. It completely tore his pectoral away from his shoulder, but he did survive the ordeal. Our brains prevent, or regulate, as some may say, this strength output in the motor cortex area. To override it, this is called hysterical strength, and this prevents our muscles from breaking bones or tearing themselves into oblivion just because we want to do something. Because let's be honest here, if we could use all of our strength whenever we wanted, people would be absolutely doing that, which would lead to a lot of them being completely maimed. I would suggest then, when the Grenadier sees cog soldiers, this creature basically activates its own hysterical strength, further inducing the lethality that it can inflict, which is what made it so successful in the opening days of the Locust War. And finally, we come to the portion of the brain that clearly would need to be increased in size, given it's more of a lore thing than an actual in-game thing. Locust hunters, as they were called, are specific variants of Grenadiers, whose entire job was to assassinate high-value targets. Now, how could this be accomplished? While not too intelligent, their bodies would fall back on a more animalistic trait and tendency in order to get the job done. In this case, the olfactory bulb would be much larger, and they would quite literally sniff out their prey and begin actively hunting them down. And this explains the more flat face and larger nose, as they could take in scents at a much higher capacity. Their noses are also not really designed to warm or cool the air, given that they were just in a cave most of the time, so there wasn't too many variations. So it doesn't really do that as effectively, but instead, it would be more about getting the scent molecules recognized, as sensory information would then be sent to the olfactory bulb. This bulb exists just below the frontal lobe, and its entire purpose is to actively process scent. In humanity, this bulb is really not as well developed, as we don't really hunt prey by smell, and instead we rely on eyesight for our ability to take things out. But without a doubt, given other animals have much more developed olfactory bulbs and are extremely effective at hunting, it's a highly viable strategy. And if you're hunting something down, they're not going to be sent behind enemy lines as far as I know. Their main plan, although they could be, because, you just got emergence holes. Their main plan was, let's say, there's a colonel dictating the battle and he's right over there and you're over here. Again, they rush the lines. So because they're rushing the lines and they're sniffing this dude out, they're just going to basically bolt towards him. But this growth would also further push the frontal lobe to smaller proportions as a result from the simple fact that size is limited in the skull of the locust grenadier, and using the human brain as a template, some areas are preferred for their abilities over others. But what exactly happens when humans and grenadiers meet in open combat? The reality is, unless you're a cog soldier or heavily armed stranded, things are not going to go well. Grenadiers are absolutely brutal in their methods, and they just simply have the strength to do it. Curb stomping is a fairly standard outcome. In fact, they will actively run after those who are injured in battle, even if being fired on in order to take them out due to the increased aggression. Sometimes, however, if they are not actively being shot at, they will rip the arm off a human and literally beat them to death with it. Of course, given all the arteries and veins in there, that doesn't really take all that long. Even with his ability to resist damage, though, from thicker bones, skin, muscle, absorbing projectile impacts, as a sergeant once put it, they're tough, but they ain't invincible. The Gnasher, fired point blank, takes them back to factory pre-assembly quite readily. Sniper rounds will still give their minds some fresh air, and enough Lancer rounds put into their midsection will ensure that their triple heartbeat stops forever. Not to mention, the cogs are also not exactly weak either. Have you seen Clayton Carmine? Curb stomping is still, as always, a viable method of destroying the Grenadier. The key is just getting them to drop down before they even have a chance to get close to you and attach a grenade to the side of your head. But anyhow, I want to hear what you guys think. Would you like me to continue on with the Gears of War video? Because I am probably just going to do that anyways. Let me know down in the comments. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and channel links in the description. But speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. At the Astronaut tier, we have Bananas Art Epic. Thank you, my man. Next up at the Astrophysicist tier, we have Death's Dancer. Thank you as well, bro. And at the Scientist tier, we have Dakota23, Frank Shaftcrank. I actually love electric cars and the anglerfish, again, which is a lie. Electric cars aren't bad, but anglerfish, nah, I'm good. Invictus Echo, Metric System, Official Texan, and Stutz. And to the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's support as well. The channel literally cannot run without you. Especially, I don't know if you guys have seen this or you heard what's kind of going on YouTube. It's not just the AI thing. All views, like obviously, you got the bigger YouTubers and stuff, like I'm sure Mr. Beast is doing fine. But essentially all views across most people's channels are down since I think it was like the February, March range. And people just really aren't recovering as much as they did. I'm not really sure what's up. I've seen it on this channel. Actually, I've seen it on both my channels. I've seen it on comparable channels. It's very strange, but YouTube's doing something in the background. So the fact that you saw this, I do appreciate you watching, and I hope you enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.